My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 42 years old. I never imagined that the most devastating moment of my life would come not from dying but from what I heard while I was technically dead. The words my sister-in-law, Vanessa, spoke to the paramedics as my heart stopped beating. Don't bother with her. She's not worth the effort. Those words changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should probably start from the beginning, back when things were simpler, back when I still believed that family meant unconditional love and support. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, the younger of two children. My brother Ethan was 4 years older than me, and for most of our childhood, we were close in that protective older sibling kind of way. He looked out for me during our parents' messy separation when I was 9, and later when our father disappeared from our lives entirely, Ethan stepped into a role he was too young to fill. Our mother, Patricia, worked as a nurse at Providence Hospital, pulling double shifts to keep us fed and housed. Those years taught me resilience, but they also instilled in me a deep appreciation for medical professionals and a terror of hospitals that would become relevant much later. Ethan and I developed different coping mechanisms for our unstable childhood. He became obsessed with creating the perfect family life he felt we'd been denied, while I threw myself into academics and eventually built a career in urban planning that took me across the country. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I had established myself professionally in Seattle, working for the city's development department. I had purchased a modest craftsman-style home in the Wallingford neighborhood, cultivated a small but meaningful circle of friends, and generally built a life I was proud of. I was single by choice, having watched too many friends compromise themselves in relationships that drained more than they gave. My independence was hard-won and fiercely protected. Ethan, meanwhile, had stayed in Portland. He'd gone into pharmaceutical sales, a career that suited his natural charisma and ability to connect with people. He'd married young, to his college girlfriend Melissa, and they'd had 2 kids before divorcing when Ethan was 31. The divorce hit him hard, not because he'd been particularly in love with Melissa, but because it represented the failure of his idealized family vision. He threw himself into work, traveled constantly, and seemed to be searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then he met Vanessa Caldwell at a medical conference in San Francisco, and everything about my brother changed. Vanessa was a pharmaceutical representative for one of the major companies, the kind of woman who walked into a room and commanded attention without seeming to try. She was 34 when they met, 3 years younger than Ethan, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested expensive salons and personal trainers. Her dark hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her wardrobe a carefully curated collection of designer pieces that screamed success. When Ethan first told me about her, his enthusiasm was almost manic. "Claire, she's incredible," he gushed during one of our weekly phone calls. "She's brilliant, ambitious, and she gets it. She understands the demands of this industry. Plus, her family is really well connected in the Portland business community." That last part should have been my first warning sign. Ethan had always been somewhat status conscious, a lingering insecurity from our childhood poverty, but I'd never heard him describe someone primarily through the lens of their family connections. Still, I was happy he'd found someone who excited him, and I looked forward to meeting this woman who had captured my brother's heart so completely. The meeting happened 6 months into their relationship, when Ethan invited me to Portland for Vanessa's birthday celebration at an upscale restaurant in the Pearl District. I drove down from Seattle on a Friday afternoon, fighting traffic the whole way, and arrived at the restaurant fashionably late due to an accident on I-5. Vanessa greeted me with air kisses and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Claire, Ethan has told me so much about his little sister," she said, her voice warm but somehow condescending. I was 40 to her 34, hardly anyone's little anything, but I let it pass. First meetings are always awkward. Throughout dinner, I observed the dynamics between them. Ethan was attentive to the point of being deferential, constantly checking Vanessa's reactions before expressing opinions. When I mentioned a sustainable housing project I was working on, Vanessa interrupted to talk about a luxury condo development her father was investing in, dismissing my public housing initiative as Well-intentioned but ultimately unrealistic. The market decides what gets built, she said with absolute certainty. Trying to force affordable housing into desirable neighborhoods just brings down property values. My father always says that economics are more honest than politics. I bit my tongue, not wanting to start a political argument at what was supposed to be a celebration, but I saw Ethan's discomfort with the exchange. The brother I knew had always been passionate about social issues, had volunteered at homeless shelters during college. This new deference to market-driven thinking seemed foreign to his nature. The relationship moved quickly. Within 8 months of meeting, they were engaged. Within a year they were married in an elaborate ceremony at the Empress Hotel in Victoria, British Columbia, with over 200 guests, most of whom seemed to be Vanessa's family connections and business associates. I was a bridesmaid, wearing a dusty rose dress that Vanessa had selected without consulting any of us about style or color preferences. Our mother whispered to me during the reception, "I barely recognize my own son in all this pageantry. When did Ethan become someone who cares about centerpiece arrangements and seating charts?" "People change when they're in love," I offered, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "This isn't love changing him," Mom said quietly. "This is fear. He's terrified she'll leave like Melissa did." After the wedding, Ethan and Vanessa settled into a house in Portland's West Hills, a neighborhood of sprawling homes and careful landscaping that spoke of old money and new ambitions. Vanessa immediately began renovating, despite the house being only 5 years old. Every time I visited, something else had been changed: walls painted, furniture replaced, rooms reconfigured to match whatever she'd seen in Architectural Digest. My visits became less frequent, not because I was deliberately avoiding them, but because every invitation came with subtle strings attached. Vanessa would suggest we all go to her country club, where she'd spend the afternoon introducing me to people as Ethan's sister who works for the government, emphasizing the last part in a way that made it sound vaguely disappointing. Or she'd plan elaborate dinner parties where I was clearly the token single person, seated next to whatever bachelor she'd decided needed a girlfriend. "You should really think about settling down," she told me one evening after too much wine. "Women our age can't afford to be too picky. Your biological clock is ticking." "I'm perfectly happy with my life as it is," I replied evenly, though inside I was seething. "Of course you are," she said with a patronizing smile. "But wouldn't it be nice to have someone to come home to? A real family?" The implication that my life was somehow incomplete without a husband and children was offensive enough. But the suggestion that I didn't have a real family, because I was unmarried, struck a deeper nerve. I had Mom. I had Ethan. I had close friends who felt like chosen family. But Vanessa's worldview apparently didn't include those relationships as legitimate. Ethan said nothing during these exchanges, staring at his wine glass or suddenly finding something fascinating about the wall art. His silence hurt more than Vanessa's words. The brother who had once defended me against playground bullies now couldn't manage to speak up when his wife belittled my life choices. Things deteriorated further when Vanessa became pregnant with their first child. Suddenly, every conversation revolved around nursery themes, designer baby clothes, and her plans to hire a full-time nanny despite taking a year off work. When she gave birth to a daughter they named Olivia, I drove down to Portland to meet my niece, bringing thoughtful gifts and genuine excitement about becoming an aunt. Vanessa barely acknowledged the presents. I'd carefully selected a handmade quilt from a local artisan, a collection of diverse children's books, a savings bond for Olivia's future. "How practical," she said, in a tone that suggested practical was synonymous with boring. She then proceeded to show me the designer nursery that had cost more than some people's annual salary, complete with a custom crib that looked like something from a French chateau. I adored Olivia from the moment I met her, this tiny human with Ethan's eyes and what would clearly become Vanessa's dark hair. I wanted to be involved in her life, to be the kind of aunt who took her to museums and parks, who read her stories and helped with homework as she grew. But Vanessa controlled access to my niece with subtle but effective gatekeeping. When I called to ask about visiting, Vanessa would say they were too busy, that Olivia was on a strict schedule that couldn't be disrupted, that unexpected visitors stressed the baby. When I sent gifts for birthdays and holidays, I rarely received acknowledgement beyond a perfunctory thank you text. Photos I requested of my niece were slow to arrive, if they came at all. Vanessa's just adjusting to motherhood, Ethan explained when I finally confronted him about the distance growing between us. She's particular about Olivia's routine. You know how new mothers can be. But I didn't know. Because Vanessa had effectively cut me out of that experience. The few times I did manage to visit, she hovered constantly, criticizing my attempts to help. That's not how we hold her. She doesn't like being played with that way. We don't allow screen time. Every interaction became a minefield of unspoken rules. I was apparently expected to intuit. 2 years later, Vanessa had a son they named Camden. By then, I'd largely accepted my peripheral role in their family. I sent gifts. I called on birthdays. I maintained the appearance of closeness while feeling increasingly like a stranger to my own brother. Mom noticed the change too, mentioning during one of our weekly calls that Ethan seemed different, diminished somehow, like he was constantly walking on eggshells. That woman has him completely under her control, Mom said bluntly. He doesn't make a decision without checking with her first.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He even asked her permission to have dinner with me for my birthday. Maybe that's just how their marriage works, I suggested, though I didn't believe it. That's not marriage, honey. That's subordination. Around this time, my own life took a difficult turn. I was diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia after experiencing several episodes of racing heartbeat and dizziness. My cardiologist, Dr. Ellen Pacheco, explained that I had a condition called supraventricular tachycardia, episodes where my heart would suddenly beat too fast. Most of the time, it was manageable with medication, but there was always a risk of a more serious event. You'll need to monitor your symptoms closely, Dr. Pacheco advised. Avoid excessive caffeine, manage stress, and if you ever feel like you're going to pass out, call 911 immediately. I told Ethan about the diagnosis during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. His concern seemed genuine, asking detailed questions about treatment and prognosis. Is this something genetic? Should I get checked? It can run in families, I admitted. Dr. Pacheco suggested that you and Mom might want to get screened, just to be safe. Vanessa's voice echoed in the background. We don't have time for unnecessary medical tests, Ethan. We're perfectly healthy. That was the entirety of her response to my health crisis. Dismissal of the idea that it might affect her perfect family. Ethan dutifully got himself checked and was fine, but the lack of genuine concern from Vanessa registered. In her world, my medical issues were an inconvenience, a potential genetic flaw that might have contaminated her husband's DNA. My condition remained stable for nearly a year. I adjusted my lifestyle, took my medications religiously, and learned to recognize the warning signs of an episode. Life went on. I received a promotion at work, leading a major urban renewal project in Seattle's South Lake Union neighborhood. I traveled to Copenhagen to study their approach to sustainable urban development. I cultivated my garden, took weekend trips to the San Juan Islands, and generally lived a full life that didn't require Vanessa's approval or Ethan's increasingly rare presence. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening in October when Ethan called, his voice tight with emotion. Claire, it's Mom. She's had a stroke. She's at Providence Hospital in Portland. You need to come now. I was in my car within 15 minutes, throwing clothes into a bag and heading south on I-5 through gathering darkness and rain. The 3-hour drive felt endless, my mind racing through every conversation I'd had with Mom in recent weeks, looking for signs I'd missed. She'd seemed fine during our last call, cheerful even, telling me about a painting class she'd started taking at the community center. I arrived at the hospital just after midnight, wet from running through the parking lot, my heart pounding from fear and exertion. Ethan was in the ICU waiting room, looking haggard and older than his 46 years. Vanessa sat beside him, perfectly composed despite the hour, her designer coat folded neatly beside her. How is she? I asked, embracing Ethan briefly before turning toward the ICU doors. Stable, he said. They caught it early. She called 911 herself when she realized something was wrong. They're running tests, but the neurologist thinks she'll recover most of her function with rehabilitation. The relief was overwhelming. I sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how tense I'd been during the drive. Can I see her? Thanks for watching. Family only, 2 at a time, the ICU nurse had told us. And only for 15 minutes each hour. Ethan and I went in together, leaving Vanessa in the waiting room. Mom looked small in the hospital bed, an IV in her arm, monitoring equipment beeping softly around her. But her eyes were alert, and when she saw us, she managed a lopsided smile. My babies, she said, her speech slightly slurred but understandable. Don't you two look worried? Mom, you scared us, I said, taking her hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. Scared myself too, she admitted. 1 minute I was watching television, the next my arm went numb and I couldn't talk right. Funny thing about being a nurse, you know exactly what's happening when you're having a stroke. We stayed with her as long as the nurses allowed, and I felt my connection to my mother like a physical thing, this woman who had sacrificed so much to raise us. When we returned to the waiting room, Vanessa was on her phone, barely looking up as we approached. I've arranged for a home health aide, she announced. Someone will need to stay with Patricia when she's discharged. Obviously, it can't be us, we have the children to consider, but I've found an excellent service that specializes in stroke recovery. I'll take a leave from work, I said immediately. I can stay with her, help with rehabilitation. Vanessa's expression suggested I'd said something amusing. Claire, that's sweet, but you can't just abandon your job for months. That's what professionals are for. Besides, you live in Seattle. How would that even work? My mother is more important than my job, I said firmly. And I can work remotely for a while. It's not a problem. Well, if you're sure you want to disrupt your entire life, Vanessa said, making it sound like a character flaw. Though I suppose it's not like you have a family depending on you. The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air. Ethan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I decided then that I was done trying to maintain a relationship with Vanessa. My focus would be on Mom's recovery and rebuilding whatever was left of my connection with my brother, with or without his wife's approval. Over the following weeks, I split my time between Portland and Seattle, working remotely from Mom's apartment while managing her recovery. She made remarkable progress, her speech improving daily, her mobility returning gradually through intensive physical therapy. During those long days and nights, we talked more honestly than we had in years. Ethan's changed, she said one afternoon as we worked through her exercises. He's not the boy I raised. That woman has remade him into something else. People grow up, Mom. They change. There's growing up. And there's losing yourself, she countered. Your brother has lost himself in trying to be what she wants. It's sad to watch. I couldn't argue with that assessment. During his visits to see Mom, Ethan was different than when he'd come alone versus when Vanessa accompanied him. Without her, he was more relaxed, more like his old self, laughing at old stories and helping with Mom's care without being asked. With Vanessa present, he became formal, checking his phone constantly, cutting visits short with vague references to prior commitments. The turning point came 3 months after Mom's stroke, when she'd recovered enough to live independently again with minimal assistance. I'd planned a small celebration dinner at her apartment, just the 4 of us, marking her remarkable recovery. I'd cooked her favorite meal, lasagna with homemade sauce, and set the table with flowers from her garden that I'd been maintaining. Vanessa and Ethan arrived 20 minutes late. Vanessa walked in, surveyed the modest apartment with barely concealed disdain, and announced, "We can only stay an hour. We have a dinner party at the Hendersons at 7. The Hendersons were apparently important business contacts of Vanessa's father, more important than celebrating her mother-in-law's recovery from a stroke. Mom's face fell slightly, but she rallied, determined to enjoy what time we had. Throughout dinner, Vanessa dominated the conversation, talking about renovations she was planning for their summer house on the Oregon coast, a property her parents had helped them purchase. She discussed interior designers and landscape architects with the assumption that everyone found this endlessly fascinating. "How's your project in Seattle going, Claire?" Mom asked, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. Before I could answer, Vanessa interjected, "Oh, speaking of that, Claire, I've been meaning to mention something. Ethan's cousin Mark is getting married next month, and they need a date set. Obviously, we can't have it interfering with the holidays. I don't see what that has to do with my work project. I said, confused. Vanessa gave me that patronizing smile I'd come to dread. Well, someone needs to handle the logistics. And since you're good at organizing things and don't have family obligations, she let the sentence hang, the implication clear. I was the family spinster, useful for handling tasks no one else wanted. I'm sure Mark and his fiancée can handle their own wedding logistics, I said evenly. You'd think. Vanessa sighed dramatically. But they're completely overwhelmed. It would really help the family if you could step in. That's what aunts do, right? Help out? The manipulation was transparent but effective. Saying no would make me seem selfish, unwilling to help family. The fact that I barely knew Ethan's cousin Mark, that I'd met him maybe 3 times in my entire life, apparently didn't factor into Vanessa's calculations. Ethan remained silent through this entire exchange, focused on his food with intense concentration. Mom, however, had no such reservations. Vanessa, dear, Claire has a demanding career and has just spent 3 months helping me recover. I think she's done quite enough for the family, don't you? The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Vanessa's smile became fixed, her eyes hard. Of course, Patricia. I didn't mean to suggest Claire wasn't pulling her weight, though I suppose different people have different ideas about family obligations. The dinner ended shortly after, with Vanessa citing their dinner party commitment. As they left, Ethan hung back for a moment. Sorry about that, he muttered. Vanessa's just stressed about her father's business expansion. She doesn't mean anything by it. Yes, she does, I said quietly. And you know it. He looked like he wanted to argue, to defend his wife, but something in my expression stopped him. Instead, he just squeezed my shoulder and left. That woman is poison, Mom said flatly after they'd gone. And your brother is too weak to see it or too scared to admit it. I couldn't disagree. But I also couldn't figure out how to help Ethan when he seemed determined to stay in a relationship that was slowly erasing who he'd been. All I could do was maintain my own boundaries and be there if he ever decided he needed an exit. What I didn't know then was that the real test of family loyalty was coming, and it would arrive in the most unexpected and terrifying way possible. The crisis came on a cold February afternoon, 6 months after Mom's recovery celebration dinner. I was in Seattle, working from home on a particularly complex zoning proposal that required my full attention. The rain hammered against my windows in that relentless Pacific Northwest way, and I'd made myself a 3rd cup of coffee despite knowing I should probably switch to decaf given my heart condition. My phone rang just as I was reviewing a particularly problematic section of the proposal. Ethan's name flashed on the screen, which was unusual. We'd fallen into a pattern of texting rather than calling. Our conversations reduced to brief exchanges about Mom's health or holiday logistics. Claire, thank God, Ethan said, his voice strained. It's Mom. She's had another stroke. A bad one. She's at Providence again, but they're saying this one is more severe. You need to come. The coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. I was already moving toward my bedroom, pulling out the overnight bag I'd kept packed since the first stroke. How bad? They're not sure yet. She was unconscious when the paramedics arrived. Her neighbor found her collapsed in the hallway. His voice broke. Claire. They're talking about life support. The drive to Portland was a blur of rain and fear. I pushed my car faster than I should have, weaving through traffic, my own heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with my medical condition. I kept thinking about our last conversation 2 days earlier, how she'd been excited about a cruise she was planning with some friends from her painting class. She'd sounded so vital, so completely recovered from the first stroke. I arrived at Providence Hospital's ICU just after 7 in the evening. Ethan was there, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes red from crying. Vanessa sat apart from him, perfectly composed in a black cashmere sweater and tailored pants, tapping on her phone with manicured nails. They've got her intubated, Ethan said as I approached. The damage from this stroke is extensive. They're doing another CT scan to determine the full extent, but the neurologist said we need to prepare ourselves for difficult decisions. I felt the world tilt slightly. What kind of decisions? Before Ethan could answer, Vanessa stood and walked over. The doctors are talking about quality of life issues. Patricia is 68 years old, Claire. Even if she survives this, she'll likely have severe disabilities. We need to think practically about what she would want. The clinical detachment in her voice was chilling. This was my mother we were discussing, not some abstract medical case. She's a fighter. She came back from the last stroke stronger than anyone expected. That was different, Vanessa said with infuriating patience. The first stroke was relatively minor. This one has affected both hemispheres. The doctors are being very clear about the prognosis. I want to see her, I said, ignoring Vanessa and addressing Ethan. He nodded, standing slowly like it took effort. 2 at a time. The nurse will come get us when they're done with the scan. We waited in the fluorescent-lit ICU waiting room, time stretching and compressing in that strange way it does in hospitals. Other families occupied the space, their own dramas playing out in hushed conversations and tear-stained faces. I thought about all the times Mom had worked in these halls, how she'd comforted countless families facing similar crises. The irony of her being the patient now felt impossibly cruel. When the nurse finally came to take us back, I went in with Ethan, leaving Vanessa to her phone. Mom looked worse than she had after the first stroke. Her face was slack, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that breathed for her and monitored every vital sign. The strong, vibrant woman who had raised us seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind this fragile shell. I took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines. Mom, it's Claire. I'm here. Ethan's here. We're not going anywhere. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, but there was no response, no flutter of recognition. Ethan stood on her other side, silently crying. We stayed until the nurse gently reminded us that other family members needed their time to visit as well. Back in the waiting room, the neurologist appeared, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Dr. Ramesh. She pulled us into a small consultation room, and Vanessa immediately joined us despite not being asked. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Dr. Ramesh began. Patricia has suffered a massive bilateral stroke affecting both sides of her brain. The damage is extensive. Even with aggressive treatment, the likelihood of meaningful recovery is extremely low. We're talking about severe cognitive impairment, likely paralysis on both sides, probable loss of speech and swallowing function. The words hit like physical blows. Ethan made a sound like he'd been punched. I felt tears streaming down my face but couldn't seem to stop them. What are our options? I managed to ask. Doctor. Ramesh's expression was compassionate but direct. We can continue aggressive treatment, keep her on the ventilator, see if there's any improvement over the next few days. Or, if you believe she wouldn't want to live with such severe disabilities, we can make her comfortable and let nature take its course. She has a living will, Ethan said quietly. She updated it after the first stroke. She was very clear that she didn't want to be kept alive if there was no reasonable chance of recovery. I knew this. Mom and I had discussed it during her recovery, sitting in her sunny kitchen while she regained her speech. I don't want to be a vegetable, Claire, she'd said firmly. If my brain goes, let me go with dignity. Promise me. I'd promised, never really believing I'd have to honor that promise. We should wait, I heard myself saying. Give it a few days. See if there's any improvement. We can't make this decision now. Not when everything just happened. Vanessa spoke up. The doctors are being clear about the prognosis. Claire, dragging this out won't change anything. It will just prolong everyone's suffering, especially Patricia's. Everyone's suffering? I turned to her. Anger cutting through grief. Or your inconvenience. Is this disrupting your schedule, Vanessa? Her eyes flashed. That's completely unfair. I'm trying to be realistic about a terrible situation. Someone has to think clearly here. My mother is dying and you're talking about her like she's a problem to be managed. I shot back. Dr. Ramesh intervened. This is an emotional time for everyone. You don't need to make any decisions tonight. I'd suggest taking some time, talking as a family, reviewing Patricia's living will carefully. We can reconvene tomorrow. Ethan looked between Vanessa and me, clearly torn. Claire's right. We should wait. Give it at least a few days. Vanessa's mouth tightened but she nodded. Fine. A few days. But we're going to need to face reality eventually. That night, I stayed at the hospital while Ethan and Vanessa went home to relieve their babysitter. I sat in the ICU waiting room, dozing fitfully in uncomfortable chairs, going in to see Mom every hour when they allowed visitors. I talked to her even though she couldn't respond, telling her about my work projects, reminding her of funny stories from my childhood, begging her to fight. On the second day, there was no change. The machines kept her alive, but there was no sign of consciousness, no response to stimuli. Ethan came in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept. Vanessa arrived later, bringing coffee and looking annoyed at having to be there. "We need to talk about practical matters," Vanessa said, cornering me in the cafeteria. "Patricia's apartment, her belongings. Someone will need to handle all of that." "She's not dead yet," I said sharply. "But when she is, these things will need to be addressed. I'm just trying to plan ahead." The casual assumption of Mom's death, the eagerness to move on to logistics, made me want to scream. Instead, I walked away, unable to trust what I might say if I stayed. By the third day, I was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline. My own health was suffering. I'd missed doses of my heart medication in the chaos, and I could feel the familiar flutter of an irregular heartbeat. But I couldn't leave Mom, couldn't abandon my post. That afternoon, Ethan pulled me aside. "Claire, we need to talk about Mom's living will. I've been reading it carefully, and she was explicit. No life support if there's no reasonable chance of meaningful recovery. It's only been 3 days." I protested, though I knew he was right. The doctors had been clear. Mom wasn't coming back, not in any way that mattered. "I know this is hard," Ethan said, taking my hand. "But we're not helping her by keeping her on machines. We're just prolonging the inevitable. And it's not what she wanted." Tears streamed down my face. "I can't lose her, Ethan. Not yet. I'm not ready." "I'm not ready either," he said, his own voice breaking. "But this isn't about us. It's about honoring Mom's wishes." We met with Dr. Ramesh that evening, along with the hospital's ethics team. They reviewed Mom's living will, which was clear and legally binding. She had specified that if there was irreversible brain damage with no reasonable expectation of recovery, she did not want to be kept alive artificially. Based on the CT scans and neurological assessments, Patricia meets those criteria, Dr. Ramesh explained gently. The damage is extensive and irreversible. Keeping her on life support at this point is not consistent with her documented wishes. Vanessa had joined us for this meeting, sitting slightly apart with her arms crossed. "So we're all in agreement then. It's time to let her go." The casual way she said it, like we were deciding to cancel a subscription service, made my stomach turn. But I knew she was right. We all were right. This wasn't what Mom would have wanted. "How does it work?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Ramesh explained the process. They would remove the ventilator, make Mom comfortable with medication to ensure she didn't experience any distress, and let her pass naturally. It could take hours or days. There was no way to predict exactly. "Can we be with her?" Ethan asked. "Of course. You can stay as long as you want." Many families find it meaningful to be present. We scheduled it for the following afternoon, giving ourselves one more night to say goodbye. I spent that night at Mom's bedside, holding her hand, telling her all the things I wished I'd said more often. How much I admired her strength, how grateful I was for her sacrifices, how she taught me to be independent and resilient. I apologized for not visiting more, for letting my conflict with Vanessa create distance between us. Ethan came in the early morning hours, and we sat together in silence, both of us lost in memories of the woman who had shaped our lives. For a brief moment, we were just siblings again, united in grief and love for our mother. The next afternoon came too quickly. We gathered in Mom's room, Ethan and me on either side of her bed, Vanessa standing near the door as if maintaining some distance from the actual death. Dr. Ramesh explained what would happen, checked that we understood and consented, and then nodded to the respiratory therapist. They removed the breathing tube carefully. Mom's chest continued to rise and fall on its own, but her breathing was labored, irregular. The monitors showed her heart rate, her oxygen levels, all slowly declining. We stayed for hours. Ethan and I took turns talking to Mom, sharing memories, telling her it was okay to let go. Vanessa checked her phone periodically, which infuriated me, but I was too focused on Mom to address it. As evening approached, Mom's breathing became more strained. Her oxygen levels dropped further. The nurse assured us she wasn't in pain, that the medication was keeping her comfortable, but it was agonizing to watch. Then my own heart began to race. The familiar sensation of my condition flaring up, but worse than I'd ever experienced. My chest tightened, my vision blurred slightly. I gripped the bedrail, trying to steady myself. "Claire?" Ethan noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" "Just my condition," I managed. "It's the stress. I'll be fine." But I wasn't fine. The racing got worse, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The room started to spin. I stumbled backward, trying to reach a chair. "She's having an episode," I heard Ethan say urgently. "Someone get a doctor." The last thing I saw before darkness closed in was Vanessa's face. Not concerned but annoyed, as if I'd deliberately chosen this moment to cause a disruption. Then everything went black. What happened next, I would only piece together later from medical records and Ethan's guilt-ridden confession. My heart had gone into a severe arrhythmia, the kind my cardiologist had warned could be life-threatening. I collapsed in my mother's ICU room, ironically just feet from medical equipment and personnel. The ICU team responded immediately, as they were trained to do. They began emergency protocols, checking my vitals, preparing to stabilize me. And that's when Vanessa said the words that would change everything. According to Ethan, who was frozen in shock watching both his mother dying and his sister collapsing, Vanessa had pulled one of the responding nurses aside. In a low voice, clearly not intending for Ethan to hear but loud enough that he caught every word, she said, "Don't bother with her. She's not worth the effort. Let her go." The nurse, to her credit, ignored Vanessa completely and continued emergency treatment. But Ethan heard. And those words, spoken while I was unconscious and vulnerable, while our mother lay dying just feet away, revealed something about Vanessa that he'd been refusing to see. I didn't know any of this as I drifted in darkness. There was no bright light, no tunnel, no profound spiritual experience, just absence, a void where consciousness should have been. But somewhere in that darkness, something registered. Not words exactly, but an awareness that I was unwanted, expendable, that someone nearby wished I would simply cease to exist. The ICU team stabilized my heart rhythm using medication and electric cardioversion. They transferred me to a cardiac monitoring unit, hooking me up to machines not unlike the ones that had been sustaining my mother. I regained consciousness slowly, groggily, aware first of beeping monitors and antiseptic smells, then of a crushing sense of loss. "Mom," I tried to say, but my throat was raw from the intubation they'd performed during the emergency. "I'm here." Ethan's voice came from beside the bed. "I'm right here, Claire." I turned my head, seeing my brother's face ravaged by grief. "Mom?" I managed to croak. His expression told me everything. "She passed about an hour after they brought you down here." Peacefully. She wasn't alone. I was with her. The grief crashed over me in waves. I'd missed my mother's death because my own body had betrayed me. I hadn't been there to hold her hand at the end, to tell her one last time that I loved her. The unfairness of it all was overwhelming. "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, tears streaming down his face. "You should have been there. She knew you loved her, Claire. She knew." I wanted to believe that. Needed to believe it. But the guilt of not being present for her final moments settled into my bones, heavy and permanent. "Where's Vanessa?" I asked after a moment, not because I wanted to see her but because her absence was notable. Ethan's expression shifted, something dark crossing his features. "She left. Said she needed to get home to the kids." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but I was too wrung out to press. The doctor came in then, a cardiologist who explained that I'd experienced a severe episode of supraventricular tachycardia complicated by extreme stress. They wanted to keep me for observation, run more tests, possibly adjust my medications. I spent 3 days in the cardiac unit while my mother's body was taken to the funeral home. 3 days during which I should have been planning her funeral but was instead trapped in a hospital bed, hooked to monitors, forbidden from any exertion. Ethan handled the arrangements with the funeral director, choosing a casket, selecting flowers, writing an obituary that captured only a fraction of who Mom had been. Vanessa didn't visit me once during those 3 days. Ethan came every day, looking increasingly haggard and withdrawn. He'd sit by my bed, sometimes talking about funeral arrangements, sometimes just sitting in silence. There was something he wasn't telling me. I could sense it, but he seemed to be wrestling with himself about whether to share it. On the third day, as the doctors were preparing to discharge me, Ethan finally broke. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice strained. "About what happened when you collapsed." I waited, sensing this was important. Vanessa said something to the nurse. He continued, not meeting my eyes. "When you were unconscious, when they were trying to stabilize you, she told them not to bother with you, that you weren't worth the effort." The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, I couldn't process them, couldn't reconcile what Ethan was saying with any reasonable human behavior. "She told them to let me die?" I asked, my voice flat with shock. Ethan nodded, his face crumbling. "I heard her, Claire. I was standing right there. She said, 'Don't bother with her. She's not worth the effort. Let her go.'" The nurse ignored her. Thank God. But I heard it. I heard my wife tell medical personnel to abandon my sister. The betrayal was so profound, so incomprehensible, that for a moment I felt nothing. Then the anger came, white-hot and clarifying. Why would she say that? What have I ever done to her to make her wish me dead? "I don't know," Ethan said miserably. "I've been trying to understand it, trying to convince myself I misheard or misunderstood, but I know what I heard. And it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. Casual, dismissive, like you were an inconvenience that could be eliminated." I thought about all the subtle digs over the years, the calculated cruelties disguised as concern, the systematic exclusion from family events. What I'd taken for mere dislike or class snobbery was apparently something much darker. "What did you say to her?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Ethan admitted. "I've been in shock, honestly, and dealing with Mom's death. But I can't unsee it, Claire. I can't unknow what kind of person I married. When I look at her now, all I see is someone who told medical personnel to let my sister die. The implications of this were enormous. Ethan and Vanessa had 2 young children, a life built together, financial entanglements. He couldn't simply walk away from his marriage because his wife had revealed herself to be callous and cruel, even if that cruelty was directed at me. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard. And I can't stay married to someone who would say something like that, no matter how convenient the marriage might be." The funeral was scheduled for the following week, giving me time to recover enough to attend. I was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to avoid stress, which seemed laughably impossible given the circumstances. I stayed at Mom's apartment, surrounded by her things, sleeping in her bed because my own home in Seattle felt too far away. Ethan visited daily, helping sort through Mom's belongings, a task that was both painful and necessary. We found photo albums from our childhood, letters she'd saved, small treasures that documented a life lived with love and sacrifice. Each item was a reminder of what we'd lost. Vanessa didn't come to these sorting sessions. According to Ethan, she'd moved into their guest room and was barely speaking to him. She knew that he knew what she'd said, and rather than apologize or explain, she'd retreated into cold silence. "She's acting like I'm the one who did something wrong," Ethan told me as we packed up Mom's kitchen. "Like I betrayed her by hearing what she said and being upset about it. That's how people like Vanessa operate," I said. "They can't admit fault, so they go on the offensive, make you question yourself." "Well, it's not working this time," Ethan said grimly. "I know what I heard. And more than that, now that I'm really looking at our relationship clearly, I can see patterns I've been ignoring for years. The way she talks about people who aren't as wealthy as her family, the casual cruelty she displays toward service workers, the way she systematically cut me off from friends and family who don't meet her standards. It was painful watching my brother's illusion shatter, but also necessary. For too long, he'd been living in denial about who Vanessa really was and what their marriage had become. The day of Mom's funeral arrived gray and cold, typical February weather in Portland. The service was held at the same Methodist church where Mom had attended sporadically over the years, more for the community than deep religious conviction. The sanctuary was surprisingly full. Mom had touched many lives during her nursing career, and former patients and colleagues had come to pay their respects. I sat in the front pew next to Ethan, both of us dressed in black, both hollow-eyed from grief and lack of sleep. Vanessa sat on Ethan's other side with their children, perfectly composed in a designer black dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Olivia and Camden were well-behaved but clearly confused about what was happening, too young to really understand death. The service was beautiful in that painful way funerals often are. Mom's friends told stories about her kindness, her humor, her dedication to her patients. I gave a eulogy that I barely remember, my voice breaking multiple times as I tried to capture the essence of a woman who had meant everything to me. Throughout the service, I was acutely aware of Vanessa's presence, this woman who had wished me dead sitting just feet away from me. When mourners approached after the service to offer condolences, Vanessa played her part perfectly, the grieving daughter-in-law, accepting sympathy with gracious nods and appropriate responses. The reception was held in the church hall, tables laid with sandwiches and cookies provided by the church ladies. I moved through the crowd mechanically, accepting hugs and kind words, trying to be present for this final ritual honoring my mother. At one point, I found myself near Vanessa, who was speaking with some of Mom's friends from her painting class. I heard her say, with apparently genuine emotion, "Patricia was such a wonderful woman. We're devastated by this loss." The hypocrisy was staggering. This woman, who had told medical staff not to bother saving me as I lay dying just feet from my mother's deathbed, was now performing grief for an audience. I felt bile rise in my throat. "Excuse me," I said abruptly, needing to get away before I said or did something I'd regret at my mother's funeral. I found refuge in the church bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to compose myself. When I emerged, Ethan was waiting in the hallway. "I told her she's not welcome at the burial," he said without preamble. "The graveside service is just going to be family and close friends. She's going to take the kids home." "Ethan, you don't have to do that for me," I started. "I'm not doing it for you," he interrupted. "I'm doing it because I can't stand next to her at our mother's grave and pretend everything is okay. I can't watch her fake grief for a woman she barely tolerated. And I sure as hell can't have her there after what she said about you." The graveside service was mercifully brief, just a handful of people standing in the cold as Mom's casket was lowered into the ground next to Dad's grave. He'd died 5 years earlier, and Mom had long since forgiven him for abandoning us. I hoped wherever they were now, they'd found some peace together. As the last prayers were said and the final flowers laid, I felt something shift inside me. The grief would remain, probably forever, but underneath it was something else. A determination to honor Mom's memory by living fully, by not letting people like Vanessa diminish me, by maintaining the strength and independence she'd worked so hard to instill in me. After the burial, Ethan and I went back to Mom's apartment. We sat in her living room, surrounded by the life she'd built, and talked honestly for the first time in years about his marriage, about Vanessa, about the choices he'd made that had led him to this point. "I'm going to file for divorce," he said. "I've already consulted with an attorney. It's going to be messy, especially with the kids, but I can't stay in this marriage. Not after what she said, and not after really seeing who she is." "I support whatever you decide," I told him. "But are you sure? This is going to turn your whole life upside down." "My life is already upside down," he replied. "I've just been too afraid to admit it. Vanessa controls everything, decides everything. I barely recognize myself anymore. And if she's capable of saying what she said about you, what else is she capable of?" It was a chilling question, one that would take on even more significance in the coming weeks as the full extent of Vanessa's true nature became clear. What we'd witnessed at the hospital was just the surface of something much darker, a capacity for cruelty that went beyond simple dislike or class prejudice. But on that day, sitting in our dead mother's apartment, we didn't know what was coming. We only knew that a line had been crossed, a truth revealed that couldn't be unseen or unknown. Whatever happened next, our family would never be the same. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks after Mom's funeral. Ethan moved into a rental apartment near his office, taking only his clothes and personal items, leaving behind the carefully curated life Vanessa had constructed. The children stayed primarily with Vanessa, which tore him apart, But he knew fighting for custody when he was living in a temporary one-bedroom wouldn't help his case. Vanessa's response to the divorce filing was swift and vicious. Within days, Ethan received a letter from her attorney outlining her demands. She wanted full custody of the children, the house, half of his retirement accounts, and substantial spousal support. More concerning, she was claiming that Ethan had been emotionally abusive throughout their marriage, a complete fabrication designed to strengthen her custody position. She's rewriting history, Ethan told me over coffee at a shop near his new apartment. Telling her attorney that I isolated her from her family, controlled the finances, made her feel unsafe. None of it is true. If anything, it was the opposite. I believed him completely. I'd watched Vanessa systematically isolate Ethan from friends and family, witnessed her control over every aspect of their lives. But family court didn't operate on sibling observations. It operated on documentation, testimony, and whoever told the most convincing story. You need to document everything, I advised. Every interaction, every conversation, and you need a good attorney who specializes in false allegations. Ethan nodded grimly. I've already hired someone. She says cases like this are more common than people think. Apparently, accusing a spouse of abuse is a standard strategy for gaining advantage in custody disputes. The injustice of it infuriated me. Ethan, who had never raised his voice in anger, who had been nothing but devoted to his children, was now having to defend himself against accusations of being abusive. Meanwhile, Vanessa, who had casually suggested medical professionals let me die, was positioning herself as the protective parent. As spring arrived, I threw myself back into work, trying to rebuild some normalcy after months of crisis. My cardiology team had adjusted my medications, and I was feeling stronger physically, though the emotional toll of losing mom and nearly dying myself had left scars that weren't visible. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Ethan called me late one evening, his voice shaking. Claire, I found something. Something bad. Can you come to Portland this weekend? I need to show you in person. I drove down Friday evening, finding Ethan in his sparse apartment surrounded by documents. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. What is it? I asked, settling onto his second-hand couch. He handed me a folder. I was going through financial records for the divorce, trying to account for where our money went over the past few years. I knew Vanessa spent a lot, but I'd always trusted her to manage our accounts. That was my first mistake. I opened the folder, finding bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts. As I scanned through them, a pattern emerged. Charges to luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, jewelry stores, all on days when Ethan had been traveling for work. She was having an affair, I said, the pieces clicking together. Multiple affairs. Apparently, Ethan said bitterly. I hired a private investigator after I found the hotel charges. He's been following her for 2 weeks. She's currently seeing a surgeon at her father's hospital, but there's evidence of at least 3 other relationships over the past 4 years. The betrayal was staggering. While Ethan had been working to support their family, Vanessa had been conducting multiple extramarital affairs, spending their money to wine and dine her lovers. There's more, Ethan continued. The investigator found something else. Vanessa has been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts into accounts I didn't know about. Over $200,000 over the past 3 years. That's financial fraud, I said immediately. You need to report this. I'm going to. My attorney is preparing a motion to freeze all accounts and compel her to account for the missing funds. But Claire, this changes everything about our marriage. I thought I knew who I married. I thought, despite her flaws, she at least loved our children and wanted what was best for our family. But this suggests she's been planning an exit strategy for years. I thought about Vanessa's comment at the hospital, her casual dismissal of my life. This was someone capable of profound deception, of using people without conscience. The woman Ethan had married didn't exist. She'd been a carefully constructed fiction. The private investigator's report was even more damning than Ethan had initially suggested. Not only had Vanessa been conducting affairs, but she'd been telling her lovers that she was trapped in an abusive marriage, that she was planning to leave Ethan as soon as she could secure enough financial resources. She'd been playing the victim while simultaneously planning her husband's destruction. She's been setting me up. Ethan realized as we read through the report, the abuse allegations aren't spontaneous. She's been laying groundwork for months, maybe years. Telling her friends I'm controlling, documenting arguments we never had, creating a narrative that positions her as the victim. When Ethan's attorney filed the motion revealing the affairs and financial fraud, Vanessa's response was to escalate her abuse allegations. She filed for a restraining order, claiming Ethan had threatened her when confronted about the missing money. She submitted text messages that appeared to show Ethan making violent threats, messages he swore he never sent. She's faking evidence, Ethan said, showing me the alleged texts. Look at the timestamps. These were supposedly sent when I was in a meeting with clients. I have witnesses who can confirm I was nowhere near my phone during these times. The forensic examination of Ethan's phone proved the messages were fabricated, likely created using one of the many apps that allow you to generate fake text conversations. But the damage was done. The family court judge, required to err on the side of caution in abuse allegations, granted a temporary restraining order that prohibited Ethan from being alone with his children. Watching my brother's pain as he was systematically separated from his kids was agonizing. Olivia and Camden, who didn't understand what was happening, could only see their father during supervised visits at a clinical facility. Ethan would come back from these visits devastated, describing how the kids asked why they couldn't go home with him, why everything had changed. She's poisoning them against me, he said after one particularly difficult visit. Camden told me that Mommy said Daddy is in trouble for being mean. He's 5 years old, Claire. He shouldn't be dealing with any of this. The turning point came during Vanessa's deposition. Under oath, forced to answer questions from Ethan's attorney, her carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. When confronted with evidence of the affairs, she claimed they were responses to Ethan's emotional abuse. When asked about the missing money, she insisted it was for household expenses, a claim that fell apart when presented with receipts for luxury purchases and hotel stays. Most damaging was when she was asked about her comment at the hospital. Ethan's attorney had tracked down the ICU nurse who had been present when I collapsed, and she'd agreed to testify. When confronted with this, Vanessa first denied saying anything, then claimed she'd been misheard, then finally admitted she'd said something in the heat of the moment, but insisted it was taken out of context. What context would make telling medical personnel not to save your sister-in-law acceptable? The attorney pressed. Vanessa had no good answer. Her composure, which had remained intact through most of the deposition, finally cracked. She was always in the way, Vanessa snapped. Always interfering in our marriage. Always judging me. The whole family treated me like an outsider. The admission, captured on video deposition, was devastating to her case. It revealed the depth of her animosity toward me and, by extension, her willingness to deceive and manipulate for her own ends. If she could casually suggest letting me die, what else was she capable of? The judge in the custody case, presented with evidence of affairs, financial fraud, fabricated abuse allegations, and Vanessa's shocking statement at the hospital, reversed the custody arrangement. Ethan was granted primary custody of the children, with Vanessa receiving supervised visitation until she completed a psychological evaluation. The day Ethan brought Olivia and Camden to his apartment for their first overnight stay, I was there to help. The kids were confused and upset, missing their mother despite everything. But Ethan was patient, explaining in age-appropriate terms that sometimes adults make mistakes, that families change but love remains constant. Is Mommy in trouble? Olivia asked, her 6-year-old face serious. Mommy made some choices that weren't good for our family, Ethan said carefully. But we're going to be okay. All of us, including Mommy, we're all going to be okay eventually. I wasn't sure I believed that. But I admired his ability to shield his children from the worst of what their mother had done and tried to do. The divorce was finalized 6 months after it began. Ethan received primary custody, the house was sold and proceeds divided, and Vanessa was ordered to repay the funds she'd fraudulently taken from their joint accounts. She fought every ruling, filed multiple appeals, but ultimately lost on every front. The truth had a way of emerging when properly examined. I rebuilt my relationship with Ethan over those months, finding my way back to the brother I'd known before Vanessa. He was different now, more cautious about trust, more aware of how relationships could be weaponized. But he was also more present, more honest, more willing to acknowledge his own mistakes. I let her isolate me from you, he admitted one Sunday as we watched Olivia and Camden play in his apartment. I saw what she was doing, the little digs and exclusions, and I chose to ignore it because confronting it would have disrupted my perfect family fantasy. You were trying to make your marriage work, I said. That's not a character flaw, but I sacrificed you to do it. I let my wife treat you terribly because it was easier than standing up to her. I couldn't argue with that. It was true, but holding on to that anger would only poison us both. We survived, I said simply. Both of us. That's what matters. Mom's death had taught me that life was too short for holding grudges, that family was worth fighting for even when it disappointed you. Ethan had made mistakes, but he'd also found his way back when it mattered most. As for Vanessa, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to California, starting over where her reputation remained intact. She maintained minimal contact with her children, visits dwindling to holidays and birthdays. Olivia and Camden would grow up largely without their mother, a tragedy that Vanessa had authored through her own choices. Sometimes I think about those moments when I was unconscious